I've told a lot of stories over the years, but this is one I usually keep buried. Not because it was the biggest crime I ever committed, and not because it made me the most money. I keep it buried because it was the first time I realized that sometimes the people you think you're using are actually using you. This happened about 12 years ago. Back then, I was broke, impatient, and convinced I was smarter than everyone else. I had bounced between jobs, collected more debt than I cared to admit, and spent most evenings sitting in cheap bars listening to people talk about easy money. Every story sounded the same. Someone knew someone who knew someone, and suddenly they were driving a new truck or flashing stacks of cash. That's how I met Darren. Darren had a way of making illegal things sound completely ordinary. He never called anything a crime. He called it an opportunity. According to him, there were wealthy buyers who needed people with clean records to purchase items on their behalf. They couldn't do it themselves because of paperwork, regulations, or business complications. All I had to do was sign some forms, collect a fee, and walk away. A straw buyer. At first I laughed it off. It sounded shady, and I wasn't completely reckless yet. But Darren kept talking. He knew exactly how much debt I had. He knew my car was one missed payment away from being repossessed. He knew I was desperate. The offer was simple: one transaction, one signature, and I'd earn more money in a day than I usually made in a month. I wish I could say I wrestled with the decision. The truth is I didn't. I spent a week pretending to think about it while secretly calculating how fast I could spend the money. That was the beginning. What I didn't know was that the deal Darren was offering wasn't just illegal. It was a trap. A few days after our first conversation, Darren called and asked me to meet him at a diner on the edge of town. He showed up late, carrying a folder thick with paperwork. He slid it across the table like it was nothing. Inside were forms, copies of IDs, and documents connected to a purchase he wanted me to make. I remember staring at the pages and feeling that little warning signal in the back of my head. Nothing looked completely normal. Nothing looked completely illegal either. That gray area was exactly what made it dangerous. Darren sensed my hesitation immediately. He started talking numbers. The fee had gone up. Apparently the buyer was in a hurry. Half the money would be paid upfront, the rest after everything was finished. The moment he handed me the envelope, my doubts weakened. I told myself I was only helping with paperwork. I told myself I wasn't responsible for whatever happened afterward. Looking back, that was the first lie I told myself. Once I agreed, Darren stopped being vague and started acting like a project manager. He had a timeline, instructions, and answers for every question before I even asked them. That should have been another warning sign, but at the time I saw it as professionalism. The purchase was scheduled for the following week. My job was simple: walk into the business, provide my identification, sign the paperwork, and complete the transaction in my own name. Afterward, I would transfer the item to the real buyer through a separate arrangement that Darren would handle. To make everything look legitimate, we spent several days preparing. Darren coached me on what to say if anyone asked questions. He even rehearsed casual conversations with me so my story would sound natural. The more we practiced, the more nervous I became. At night I kept imagining things going wrong. Yet every morning I convinced myself I was overthinking it. I wasn't preparing for a business deal. I was preparing to commit a crime while pretending it was something else. The morning of the transaction, I woke up before my alarm. I barely slept the night before. My stomach felt tight, and I kept checking the envelope Darren had given me, making sure the documents were still there. We met in a parking lot a few blocks away from the business. Darren stayed in his car and reminded me of the plan one last time. "Relax," he said. "People do this kind of thing every day." That was easy for him to say. He wasn't the one walking through the door. Inside, everything looked normal. Employees greeted customers, phones rang, and paperwork moved across desks. For a few minutes, I almost convinced myself nothing illegal was happening. Then the questions started. The employee handling my transaction was friendly but unusually thorough. He asked about my job, my income, and why I wanted to make the purchase. They were routine questions, but every answer felt like a test. I smiled, repeated the story Darren had taught me, and signed the first documents. My hands were shaking the entire time. About halfway through the paperwork, the atmosphere changed. It wasn't dramatic. No alarms. No accusations. Just small things that felt out of place. The employee stepped away from the desk twice to speak with a manager. Each time he returned, he smiled, but the smile looked forced. Another staff member appeared nearby and started organizing papers that didn't seem to need organizing. I noticed them glance in my direction more than once. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe it wasn't. The problem with doing something you know is wrong is that every normal event starts feeling suspicious. I tried to focus on the forms in front of me. My rehearsed answers still came out smoothly, but my confidence was fading. I could feel sweat collecting under my collar. Then the manager approached and introduced himself. He was polite, almost overly polite. He asked a few casual questions about the purchase. Nothing difficult. Nothing confrontational. Still, I had the strange feeling that I was being studied rather than helped. For the first time, I considered walking away. I didn't. By the time the manager finished speaking with me, I had a choice. I could make an excuse, leave the building, and forget the whole thing, or I could continue. I continued. That decision still bothers me because nobody forced me to stay. Darren wasn't standing beside me. No one threatened me. I chose to keep going because I wanted the money more than I wanted peace of mind. The final paperwork took another 20 minutes. Every signature felt heavier than the last. I remember staring at the lines where my name appeared and realizing I was creating a record that connected everything directly to me. When the employee handed over the completed documents, I expected relief. Instead, I felt trapped. Outside, Darren looked pleased when I told him everything was finished. He congratulated me as if I had accomplished something impressive. Then he instructed me to wait for further directions. That part wasn't in the original plan. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something important had changed, and that I wasn't being told the whole story. The call came later that evening. I expected Darren to tell me where to deliver the item and how soon I'd receive the rest of my payment. Instead, he sounded distracted. His confidence from earlier was gone. He told me there had been a small complication. I hated those words immediately. According to Darren, the original buyer didn't want to take possession right away. He needed me to hold on to everything for a few days. That wasn't what we'd agreed on. The entire reason I accepted the deal was because I wanted my involvement to be brief. When I pushed for answers, Darren became irritated. He said I was overreacting and reminded me how much money I was making. That conversation planted a seed of panic. Over the next 2 days, I called him repeatedly. Sometimes he answered. Sometimes he didn't. Each explanation was different from the last. The buyer was traveling. The paperwork wasn't ready. Someone was out of town. The excuses kept changing. And the more they changed, the more I started to believe I wasn't a partner in the deal. I was the fall guy. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was at work. The caller identified himself as an investigator and asked if we could speak about the recent purchase made in my name. The moment I heard those words, my chest tightened. I tried to sound calm. I asked what this was regarding. He didn't reveal much, but he wanted to verify information connected to the transaction. His tone remained professional, yet every question felt dangerously precise. Where had I learned about the purchase? Why had I chosen that particular item? Had anyone assisted me? I stuck to the story Darren and I had rehearsed. After the call ended, I immediately tried contacting Darren. Nothing. I called again. Still nothing. Hours passed without a response. That silence terrified me more than the investigator's questions. Up until then, I had convinced myself Darren had everything under control. But now it felt like he had disappeared the moment things became risky. That night I barely slept. Every sound outside my apartment caught my attention. Every passing car made me glance through the window. For the first time, I genuinely believed I might be caught. The next morning, I skipped work and drove across town looking for Darren. I knew a few places he frequented: a bar, a repair shop where he knew the owner, and a small apartment building where he'd once claimed to be staying. No luck. At the bar, the bartender recognized his name but said he hadn't seen him in days. At the apartment building, nobody answered the door. Everywhere I went, I felt like I was chasing a ghost. As the hours passed, frustration replaced fear. The more I thought about it, the more obvious it became. Darren had handled every detail except the one thing that mattered most: responsibility. My name was on the paperwork. My identification had been used. If investigators followed the trail, it would lead directly to me. By evening, panic returned. I started gathering documents, deleting messages, and throwing away notes connected to the deal. At the time, I told myself I was protecting my privacy. In reality, I was trying to erase evidence and convince myself I still had some control over the situation. A week after the investigator's first call, I was asked to come in for an interview. The word voluntary was used several times, but it didn't feel voluntary. Ignoring the request seemed worse, so I showed up. The office was smaller than I expected. No bright lights. No dramatic interrogation room. Just a desk, a recorder, and two people who already seemed to know more than they were saying. At first, the questions were straightforward. They asked about my background, my finances, and the transaction itself. I repeated the story I practiced so many times that it almost sounded believable to me. Then they started mentioning details I hadn't expected. Dates. Phone records. Names. Little pieces of information that chipped away at my confidence. I realized they weren't trying to catch me in a single lie. They were comparing every answer against facts they already had. By the end of the interview, my mouth was dry and my nerves were shot. Walking out of that building, I understood something terrifying. The investigation was much further along than I'd imagined. After the interview, I spent days replaying every question in my head. The investigators had been polite, but that almost made it worse. They never raised their voices or accused me outright. They simply let me talk. The more I thought about my answers, the more I noticed inconsistencies. Tiny details I had overlooked. Times that didn't quite match. Explanations that sounded reasonable in the moment but fell apart under scrutiny. I tried reaching Darren again. Nothing. His phone appeared disconnected. The few people who knew him suddenly knew very little. Some claimed they hadn't spoken to him in months. Others acted uncomfortable the moment his name came up. That was when the truth started sinking in. If Darren had disappeared intentionally, he had left me carrying all the risk. I became paranoid. Every unexpected knock at my door made my heart race. Every unknown number on my phone felt like bad news waiting to happen. The pressure was relentless. For the first time, I seriously considered telling investigators everything I knew, even if it meant admitting my own role in the crime. The breaking point came a few days later. Another request arrived asking me to return for further questioning. When I read it, I felt something inside me give way. For weeks, I had been living in a state of constant tension, barely sleeping, constantly looking over my shoulder, and trying to maintain a story that was becoming harder to defend. I sat alone in my apartment that night and forced myself to confront reality. The money was nearly gone. The stress wasn't. Everything I had risked my future for had already disappeared, yet the consequences remained. I thought about continuing the lie. Part of me believed I could still talk my way out of trouble. But another part recognized how foolish that idea was. The investigators kept uncovering details I never expected them to find. By morning, I had made a choice. I wasn't doing it because I had suddenly become noble. I wasn't seeking redemption. I was exhausted. And for the first time since meeting Darren, I decided to stop protecting someone who clearly wasn't protecting me. When I returned for the next interview, I walked in feeling strangely calm. Not confident, just tired. The fear that had been consuming me for weeks had reached a point where I couldn't carry it anymore. The investigators started with the same routine questions, but this time I interrupted them. I told them I wanted to correct parts of my previous statement. The room became very quiet. Once I started talking, the words came faster than I expected. I explained how I had met Darren, how the offer had been presented, and how the transaction had actually unfolded. I didn't try to paint myself as innocent. There was no point. I had known enough to understand that what I was doing wasn't legitimate. The investigators listened carefully and occasionally asked follow-up questions. Some of the information surprised them. Some clearly confirmed things they already suspected. When the interview ended, I felt both relieved and terrified. Relieved because the lies were over. Terrified because telling the truth didn't erase what I had done. It only meant I finally had to face it. The months that followed were some of the longest of my life. Once I had cooperated, the uncertainty didn't disappear overnight. Investigations moved slowly, and every new phone call made my stomach drop. I spent countless hours wondering what would happen next and whether my decision to come clean had been enough to make a difference. Eventually, the outcome became clear. I wasn't treated as an innocent bystander because I wasn't one. My cooperation mattered, but so did my actions. I faced legal consequences for my role in the scheme, and I had to accept responsibility for choices that were entirely my own. Oddly enough, that acceptance brought a sense of relief. For months I had blamed Darren for everything. He had manipulated me, lied to me, and disappeared when things became dangerous. All of that was true. But none of it changed the fact that I had agreed to participate. That realization hurt. Yet it also forced me to grow up. For the first time in years, I stopped making excuses and started examining the decisions that had put me there. Looking back now, this wasn't the biggest crime I ever became involved in, nor the most profitable. Yet it remains one of the most important lessons of my life because it exposed something ugly about myself that I had spent years avoiding. I wanted easy money. That simple desire made me ignore warning signs that would have seemed obvious to anyone thinking clearly. I convinced myself I was only helping with paperwork. I told myself I wasn't responsible for what happened afterward. Those lies were easier to accept than the truth. The truth was that I knew enough to understand I was crossing a line. If anyone reading this ever finds themselves in a similar situation, pay attention to the feeling that something isn't right. When a deal depends on secrecy, complicated explanations, or someone else's promises that nothing can go wrong, walk away. The money disappears quickly. The consequences don't. I eventually rebuilt my life, but the experience changed how I see responsibility. The people who tempt you into bad decisions may vanish when trouble arrives. You still have to live with the choices you made.